everyone. Welcome to my PDC talk on our paper From Publics to Counterpublics, Designing for Autonomy, which I co-authored with my colleagues Dr. Anais, Carlton-Parada, Victoria Gerrard, and Dr. Pandora Syperek, as part of the Counterframing Design project, which commenced in 2020, which I lead and is funded by the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council. I'm a senior lecturer in design innovation at Loughborough University in London, having come to Wales to complete a PhD in 2010. I grew up in a working class community in the rural Republic of Ireland, and it's against this that I acknowledge the struggles past and present to reclaim Irish land as I live and work in Great Britain. The work that I speak to in this paper was undertaken at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, during which, least of all, the idea that the world would emerge anew out of the crisis took hold through a sense of inevitability at our imminent and necessary socio-political transformation. Against the complex milieu of radically distinct responses to the crisis, from the libertarian right exodus to private islands, to survivalist toolkits as documented by Sharon in her 2021 essay Unboxing the Toolkit, the concept and practice of mutual aid was also resuscitated as a daily community practice, an omnipresent and quotidian response. Not long into the pandemic, law professor Dean Spade published their Mutual Aid, Solidarity, Not Charity handbook, a how-to guide for community organisers in the context of the rampant atomization of social life that posits that lasting change comes through the constant rearticulation of community. This confluence of claims and observations that COVID-19 had or has the potential to reframe how we live together, that the realities of renewed practices of collectivism in neighbourhoods and communities during the crisis imply that there are indeed alternatives. This is the context through which we began a tentative inquiry into the usefulness of our pervasive conceptions of collectivity in design. In this paper, we sought to better understand the degree to which a preoccupation with the concept of publics serves to repoliticize the field. Damien White picks up on long-standing discomfort within the field when he critiques how projects oriented to designing publics end up empowering hegemonic publics because uneven power relations prevail by failing to adequately account for labour issues, and how these projects are still beholden to deeply embedded expectations of practice and practicality. Akin to White, our project has led to insights into how concepts of framing and publics can sometimes serve to depoliticize by failing to tackle ideological dimensions of frames, or how publics are intimate to practices of norming and thus erasure. Whether White considers concepts such as Elizabeth Public's institutioning is unclear. Institutioning is conceived as a tactic to loosen the strictures of institutionalized frames and practices that structure participation. And we build on these ideas by leveraging and controverting established concepts in design on the basis that frames and practices are the sites through which we have the capacity to broaden possibilities of structuring collective agency. Still, recent scholars of publics appear to distance salient political ideas from within conceptions of publics. And thus we can intimate how, whilst concepts such as institutioning and publics are advocated as potentially liberatory, these may also work to entrench institutional norms depending on the ways in which they may give prominence to specific ideologies and practices of institutional governance. For example, growth is a ready-to-hand institutionalized frame counter to the enactment of any anti-capitalist alternative. Contrary to the tendencies towards sorting others through representation, counterpublics are distinguished by scholars as sites of alternative culture where active participation rather than ascriptive belonging prevails, reminiscent of Chris Kelty's contributory autonomy, and are sites where new practices emerge, or what anarchist theorist James Scott terms non-conforming practices, a continuous process of countering which we see as potentially productive. Whilst any collective form is in and of itself a structural framing of agency, the nature of that agency is not given. New sources of self-determination, what we here invoke as autonomy, is given potential to emerge through our reconceptualizations. Nevertheless, in a recent essay on design education institutions, Silvio Lorusso points to a problematic core at the heart of the conception of the autonomy in relation to graphic design. As graphic designers as autonomous critics, on account of its potential exclusion of complexity of how we live together. But this attributes the concept of autonomy to individuals, where our point of departure should be sociality. all the way down to draw on that infamous anthropological metaphor. So our premise is that whilst the construction of new institutions demands new practices and forms of participation, alternative conceptions of collectives, such as Counterpublics, where such new socio-material and non-conforming practices are often expressed, can be revelatory for a critical and participatory design theory practice. To this end, our design research sought to engage communities in a process of complicating public discourses to ultimately reveal insights on the complex relationship between norming and subversion evident within oppositional public discourses, as well as how co-optation and flattening of potentially non-conforming and thus radical counter-institutional practices occur. Specifically, our design research was conceived to leverage counter-ring as a continuous tactical practice to complicate discourse and precipitate insights on activist practices where radicalism and autonomy may be germinated. Our research draws on an amalgam of critical discourse analysis, situational maps, interviews, and an object cartography workshop conceived to identify prescient discursive frames being used within the field of new economy. Inevitably, the context of COVID-19 hampered participatory ambitions of the project insofar as we were removed from our planned on-site activities, and consequently we struggled to engage with some groups because either they sought compensation for participation in the research, or the research activities could have been better designed and subsequently they self-selected. Through our analysis, we arrive at conception of countering as tactical practice. The term tactical here is significant as it reflects the theory-practice approach we have taken. As Eva-Gerrard writes in What Comes After Entanglement, unlike strategies, tactics do not seek to impose their own way of doing things and thus become activist norms in themselves, but suggest how context-specific and contingent practices could be used to contest the processes through which social actors, both human and non-human, are treated as resources. Through 4 propositions for countering tactics, oppositional discourses, means and ends subversion towards autonomy, sites of radical practices, and embodied counter frames, we consider how the ensemble of research activities we have described reveals insights about norming and co-optation and how these might foster new articulations of dissensus, as well as parallel recentering of autonomy as a basis for institutional change. Next, I will speak to some examples of how this played out. In the eFlux documentary 3 or More Ecologies, a feminist articulation of eco-intersectionality, on Rohaven ecofeminism and fracking in North Dakota, Silvia Federici reminds us that as part of this anti-capitalist struggle against these mega projects and against this capitalist struggle is also a whole redefinition of what is wealth. Through our research, we solicited insights on the fraught and complex nature of the oppositional discourses through which activists seek this redefinition Federici speaks to. For instance, activists invoking various anti-capitalist frames also displayed practices that were counter to this intention. Yet conversely also displayed how certain frames were the very embodied counterframes of their often subversive daily practices, and thus central to the continuous reproduction of their own community forms through non-conforming practices that are themselves sites of radicalisms. On the other hand, the continuous recursivity of framing is revealing as community wealth building or wealth inequality counterframes, which activists variously identified as ineffectual by either falling short of the motive to productively expand the discursive space, or symbolizing a folk political retreat from global issues. Contextualizing new economy discourses against other prominent public sentiments at the time, particularly regarding discourses of hope or the new normal, also allowed us to develop more complex notions of the interwovenness of multifarious discursive frames through a process and practice of design research. The friction between discourses of climate and economy intensified during the pandemic, as arguments for regrowing the economy act in direct contradiction with degrowth demands for action on climate. and provide an illuminating example for understanding co-optation and countering practices. The economic migrant discourse heavily played into normative public sentiment in the proposition of an influx of new recruits to support an economic boom in low-income sectors. We also observed migrant activist claims. We just want that chance to showcase our talent, our intellect, our strength, in order to make this great nation greater. Or more starkly, let the good ones in. By invoking rhetoric of the good migrant, one who is responsible to the nation state they have migrated to first, they engage in trade-offs whereby the means to migrant integration is contingent on how strongly they defend the ideologies of the state within and against the global community. This process of naturalization speaks to the suppression of heterogeneity enacted through a given frame or within a perceived homogeneous or essentialized group. A norming process par excellence where palatable public discourses prevail and opposition needs to be actively sustained. At the same time, this example also speaks to the unstraightforward nature of autonomy, of potential subaltern counterpublics, where the choice, however restricted, to reproduce certain rhetoric and indeed fit a normalizing mode may also be a means-ends form of subversive integration, or perhaps compromise, in the words of Silvio Lorusso. Although certainly these normed discourses are bolstered, at least in the most visible public sphere, we cannot assume simple restriction or resistance, as this speaks to an interwoven understanding of what belonging and transgression can look like. Design's responsibility then becomes one of complicating, of Frauenberger's call to acknowledge multiple rationalities in PD. Through our exploratory design research, we have observed the complex interplay between subversion and norming practices, and also how norming is inimical to publics. This also has the capacity to challenge how or where we expect autonomy to manifest. However, we recognize too that a tension remains between understanding the norming of publics as an inherent and often productive social process and moving towards embodied knowledge, or a pluriversal worldview that seems to operate outside of this norming process. Whilst our original research objectives were displaced or reformulated through the project on account of the pandemic, we do think that this premise of countering as tactical practice is fruitful for a conception of design practice oriented away from simplification and towards engagement with discursive practices and multifarious rationalities. As Strathern reminds us, the concepts we choose are consequential to how we understand the world. Unlike publics, which are often interpreted through constant reformulations of Western democratic political structures, counterpublics rely on community, collective autonomy, within which practices of mutualism became apparent to us, and thus which are, by their very nature, important to develop tentative responses to questions around the relationship between design and labor, which we grappled with both practically and conceptually throughout this project. Our activities thus far have precipitated insightful discussions with community organizers regarding how some ineffectual practices that activists relayed to us, or those even detrimental to change, become reinforced or might be challenged. Following the workshop, one community activist communicated to us that becoming immersed in the messy realities of the discourse within their field of activism motivated them to reflect deeply on the relation between their explicit mobilizing frames and their correspondence with radical practices. In our latest project activities, not discussed in this paper, we've extended our exploration of non-conforming practices as a site through which we may better articulate and move closer to an expression of radicalisms. Up to now, this has been through workshops with activist groups, but also continues through a further project titled Uncommon Knowledge, Practices of Commons Governance, where we seek to elaborate on countering as tactical practice, as socio-material thing, as non-conforming, as sites of mutualism or commoning, or as labor, and thus as sites of anti-capitalist struggle.